Hello friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and in today's video I'm going to share you 3 amazing meals in jars recipes that filled all of these quart jars this week. But first, let's talk a little bit about where we are at in the canning year, in the canning season. You guys know we just finished the month of August, our heavy preservation season, where I challenged myself over the Every Bit Counts challenge to preserve something every day of the month. And since the beginning of September, things have definitely slowed down. We're back to school, but that doesn't mean that the canning season has ended. So we are in winter prep mode now. You can see Adam and the boys were working on some wood storage over the weekend. Adam's job right now is just piling up enough firewood to keep us warm through the winter. And typically when winter sets in, my job is to can up a lot of the stuff that is in the freezers. So I don't necessarily completely stop canning, but it is the time for me to start getting bones out of the freezer turned into broth, canning up dried beans, doing meats, and it's a great opportunity to make a lot of meals in jars. And that's especially important to me this year because I have a baby due in December. I will not be able to do my usual canning through the winter because I'll be busy with a newborn. So I'm trying to work ahead, clear out the freezer because we need freezer space for a couple heifers that we're going to be processing here in December. And also in the process of clearing out the freezers, I am getting meals in jars that will make things a whole lot easier when the baby comes. So some people do freezer meal prep. I do a lot of canning meal prep. And so that is what I'm going to bring you along on this video with me as I work on several of the meals. And so this time of year, we are mostly canning for convenience. Earlier in the year, it's about getting produce in jars quickly. Now it's about making convenient food in jars. So I started the week by taking some beef soup bones from our latest steer out of the freezer, and I had them overnight in my big roaster with some water, just making some plain beef broth. We are going to use that beef broth to make some kind of Mexican flavored pinto beans. And so I'm starting by measuring out my beans. I'm doing 1 cup per quart jar, and I do 7 quarts per batch. So we have 7 cups of pinto beans here, and I am soaking them with a little bit of apple cider vinegar. We're going to set those aside and let them soak for, about 8 hours or so. And now we're going to get to work on our jars. This is some homemade tomato paste that we made during canning season last year. This was just extra tomato paste that I decided to freeze in these little cubes instead of canning up in half-pint jars to put down in the pantry. And these are perfect for canning projects like this. So I thawed them, and I'm just putting, these are 2 tablespoons of tomato paste per quart jar here. Now we are going to season our beans, and you have the liberty with this recipe to add whatever spices and flavorings that you want. I am starting out by putting 1 bay leaf per jar. The next thing we are going to add is some cumin, and I am going to do 1 teaspoon of cumin per quart jar. And as I mentioned, you could do whatever you want. Add some paprika, add some oregano. You can make it really spicy with some cayenne powder. You're not going to affect the safety of the canning recipe simply by switching out some of the spices that you're putting in. The next thing we're going to do is add salt. I'm also doing 1 teaspoon of salt per jar. A lot of people ask, but in my canning recipes, I use pink Himalayan salt because that is what I have on hand and it works just fine for canning. The next thing we are going to do is cut up our onions. So I'm going to use red onions, and to save my eyes from a whole lot of crying and burning, what I'm just simply doing is peeling my onions and halving or quartering them and putting them directly into my food processor. You guys saw me doing this a lot through my canning last month. This is just a whole lot easier for me than chopping all of the onions by hand. And then to that same food processor, I'm going to add 2 hot peppers here. I have 1 habanero and another one is, I forget the names of these. They were a free seed that I got from Baker Creek, and they're pretty spicy. And so just 2 of those peppers will be enough for all of these quart jars. We don't want it super spicy or my small children won't eat it. So after that's all blended up in the food processor, now I'm just going to split the contents of that food processor among the 7 quart jars to try to get that evenly dispersed. So they'll get a little bit of red onion and a little bit of hot pepper in each of those jars. Once again, switching it up a little bit, maybe using white onion, maybe adding more peppers, something like that isn't really going to affect the safety of the overall product. We are going to be following the instructions for canning soups from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And through that process, that canning process and recipe that they provide, you are at liberty to change up the vegetables and beans and spices and all sorts of things. Now, little Miss Hannah there sniffed the onion. She wanted to know what that smell was. You can see her eyes are starting to water. Ooh, I should have warned her, don't hang out over those jars or you're going to start crying. Okay, the last thing that I want to add to these jars is 1 tablespoon of garlic scape powder. I chose to use this powder instead of cutting up some of our fresh garlic that we have in storage, just because this is something that I need to use up, and canning projects are a great place to use things like this garlic scape powder. Now my beans have soaked and they have swelled and absorbed a lot of water, so now I'm adding them back to the jars. And I'm just trying to evenly disperse all of those beans that were in the pot. You can see once they swell and absorb the water, it definitely looks like a lot more than 1 cup of beans. And that's why it's important not to fill your canning jars completely with dried beans before canning, because remember, they are going to absorb some liquid and swell in the jars. And now we're going to top the rest of these jars off with our beef broth that we had going in the roaster. And this is going to turn this essentially into like a spicy bean soup, which is why we can follow that recipe from the National Center for Home Food Preservation for canning a bean soup. So we're going to well, first we're going to mix the contents of that around. I'm just kind of debubbling, trying to release some air bubbles, see if we need to adjust that headspace. I'm trying to maintain 1-inch headspace from the top of the jar, get those mixed, and then that broth is kind of greasy, so we want to wipe the rims of our jars to ensure that we're going to have a good seal. And then we are going to use our 4 jars canning lids on. There you go, you can see that. These are the canning lids that I always use, and if you would like 10% off your own canning lids, check out the link and the code in the video description. We're going to get these rings on here and then get these in the pressure canner for 75 minutes. That's how long these need to process in order to be safely shelf stable. And after our 75 minutes, we have 7 quarts of kind of spicy Mexican flavored pinto beans that will be great with rice or in a bean burrito. Very excited to use those. So that's our first meal in jars that we got done this week. Later in that day, I decided I already had the red onions out and all of the same kind of spices and flavorings. The food processor was already dirty from blending up all of the onions and hot peppers from the last canning batch, so I decided to go ahead and do a batch of spicy chicken. We're going to call it a Mexican chicken. And so I'm starting out by doing the same thing that I did with the beans. I am getting my onions and my hot peppers into the food processor to be blended up and to disperse amongst our 7 quart jars. Now I believe that I used 4 large onions in both of these batches, so it's about a little more than a half an onion that's going to end up in each of the jars, and then whatever 2 of those hot peppers, split amongst the jars would equate to. And then we're going to add our spices. So we are doing our cumin here, and I am just doing, I believe, a half a teaspoon this time of the cumin. Next thing we're going to do is add a little bit of oregano, also doing a half a teaspoon of the oregano. Feel free to do whatever you want to do with these spices. I'm going to add my paprika, a half a teaspoon of that, and then we need to do our salt, also a half a teaspoon going into each jar. Finally, we're going to do 1 tablespoon again of that garlic scape powder. That's a milder form of garlic, and this is garlic scape powder that we freeze dried earlier in the year from what we had harvested. Now I've got some tomatoes that were accumulating in the fridge. I'm just going to get these chopped up and thrown into a pot. We are going to make a tomato sauce that we're going to add to these jars of Mexican chicken. So I'm just going to get that on the stove, get those to start cooking down and softening a bit, and later on we'll blend that up before we add it to the jars. But the first thing we need to do is chop up our chicken. So I am going to fill these jars pretty much all the way to the top with chunked chicken. It ends up being about 2 large chicken breasts per jar that we can fit in there, and we're really kind of stuffing it in there tightly, as you can see. And then what we're going to do is get back to our tomato sauce. It's now all softened up, and I'm just going to blend that all together. And this is with the skins and all. And once I have that blended together, I'm going to kind of strain out a little bit of the juice that's left and just kind of pour the juice over the top. Now, because these are packed so tightly, I am needing to use a chopstick to sort of debubble and push that sauce down to make sure it fills all of the little nooks and crannies in that jar that the chicken has created. And so I'm just getting busy doing that. Once again, trying to leave 1-inch headspace, so I'm having to adjust if I accidentally overfill, and try to keep that liquid line at the top at 1 inch from the top of the jar. Now, just like with the beans, this chicken is going to be amazing served in burritos or over rice. It's just really versatile. We could also add it to a soup. Very excited. Just it makes really quick lunches and dinners, which is exactly what I'm going to need once the baby is here this winter. So we're getting our lids on the jars, and because these are packed full of meat, these are going to need to process for 90 minutes in the pressure canner. That is the time for meat when it is full in the jar like that. And after 90 minutes, I had to kick the teenagers out of the kitchen because I needed my counter space. They could go drink their tea elsewhere, and we got our jars cooling down on the stove and ensuring that they were sealed. Now, we did end up with quite a bit more broth that was left in that roaster that we hadn't used that day. So what I'm going to do is fill up some of these half-gallon jars here. I think I ended up with 1.5 gallons of the beef broth. We're going to fill our jars, and then I'm going to put these in the fridge until I'm ready to do my 3rd canning process. And the great thing about taking this broth that is hot now and letting it cool down and then putting it in the fridge is that all of that fat that you can see that's kind of rising to the top will solidify while it's cold in the fridge. And then I'm going to show you when I pull them out a couple days later to use them, I can just remove that fat cap off of the top of the jar, and then my broth is much less greasy, much less fatty. Now, there's nothing wrong with fat. We are not going to toss this and waste this. This is essentially rendered tallow that ended up on the top of the broth. So I'm going to put this in a bowl, we'll store it in the fridge, and we can use this to cook some potatoes or something later on this week. But when I'm canning with the broth, you want to have less fat in the jars, because the more fat that could possibly siphon out of the jar, the greasier it gets underneath that lid, and the more likely you are to have a seal failure. And I'm going to use this broth to can some beef, which is also going to release some tallow during the canning process, and so I just think it will be overkill to have the fat from this very gelatinous broth that you can see in the jars along with the fat that's going to be released from the meat. So like I said, we are going to be canning some beef roasts. These are roasts from the most recent steer that we had processed. I'm just trying to clear some room out of the freezer to make space for more beef that we're going to be processing later this winter. And I can get it shelf stable and all cooked up and ready to go. But the first ingredient that I want to include in my canned beef is onion. And I'm using white onion. These are the Patterson onions that we harvested from the garden earlier this year. They're holding up great down in the cellar in storage. So I got about I can't remember if that was 5 or 6 onions in the food processor here, all blended up. So it's going to be, you know, a little less than an onion, maybe 3/4 of an onion that will go in each of the jars. And I don't mean to be repetitive, but just like with any of the other canning projects, you can adjust seasonings and spices and not affect the safety of the final product as long as you follow the canning times that I'm mentioning here. So I added 1 tablespoon again of the garlic scape powder. I'm adding approximately 2 small bay leaves to each of the jars. Now I'm adding 1/4 of a teaspoon of thyme. This is ground thyme to each of the jars. Then, of course, we're going to do a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and we're also going to do a 1/2 teaspoon of ground black pepper. Now, if you guys remember from my pantry tour, I have tons of canned beef down in the cellar already. But what I like about canning these roasts in this way is that they're already going to be pre-seasoned. If I want to make beef and rice, I can just dump one of these jars out and warm it up and maybe thicken the broth a little bit to make it more like a gravy. Pour it over some rice or pour it over noodles, even add it to a soup, some more broth to make it into a soup. It's just going to be really easy. The other canned broth that I have in the basement is just plain beef without any seasonings. I don't even believe they have salt in the jars. So I'm using chuck roasts here. I filled each jar to 1-inch headspace, and we are just topping those off with the rest of that broth that we had warmed up on the stove, debubbling those jars, adjusting the headspace where it's needed. And now we are ready to once again wipe those greasy rims of the jars. Make sure we have a good seal. We don't want to waste our time and not get a seal from our lids. And thankfully, I'm using my 4 jars canning lids, which always give me a great seal rate. I canned hundreds and hundreds of jars this summer, you guys, and didn't have a single seal failure that wasn't my fault. I had 1 jar that did not seal, and when I looked at it, I hadn't checked the rim of the jar and there was a chip in the glass, and that is not the fault of the canning lids. That was user error on my part. Just like with the chicken, because these are full jars of meat, they're going to process in the pressure canner for 90 minutes. And now we have lovely beef for beef and rice or beef and noodles. I'm very excited. This is a few more meals that are just done for me once the baby comes. So my final job this week was getting all of these jars wiped down. Sometimes they're a little greasy when you're canning things like meat, so I wiped them all down with a little bit of vinegar to remove any residue on the jars, got them thoroughly labeled, and moved them to the cellar. So that's it for this week. I feel very productive. Each month I'm going to bring you along with the other canning projects that I'm doing to prepare for the baby, and we will be back next week, friends. Bye.